Also, before we introduce our speaker and before we begin, I think it's worth mentioning that we're presenting this as this evening as learning that we've recently done and something that we see as being really great value in for both students and educators alike. And the ideas that Jesse will ask us to consider this evening will have us questioning what the structure of teaching and learning looks like in our school. The majority of us are joining this evening. We're educators within the public school system in Ontario, and as such, we do have bumpers that we have to play within. We're certainly not advocating that after this evening you decide that writing report cards is no longer something you will do as you fully commit to ungrading. Instead, what we want you to do is consider how this might look in your class, in your school, and experimenting with these ideas within the bumpers we have as a public school board. We are in no way suggesting that this is something you must do. It's not a mandated initiative or anything like that. We just think it's cool and see such great value in it. So as we get going in this evening is about holding that shifty headspace and having that mindset of consider this and what school might be.
Thank you, Rachel. And with that, we are super excited to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Jesse Stommel. Jesse Stommel, PhD, is a faculty member in the writing program at the University of Denver. He is co-founder of Digital Pedagogy Lab and Hybrid Pedagogy, the Journal of Critical Digital Pedagogy, and he earned his PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. Stommel is co-author of An Urgency of Teachers, the Work of Critical Digital Pedagogy, co-editor of Distributing the Digital Humanities, and co-editor of Critical Digital Pedagogy, a collection. He is best known for his work as a champion of teachers and students in higher education, and he's affiliate of the Hope Center for College Community and Justice, founded by Sarah Godric-Robb, PhD, to support #RealCollegeStudents. Stommel is a documentary, filmmaker, and teaches courses about pedagogy, film, and new media. He experiments relentlessly with learning interfaces, both digital and analog, and his research focuses on higher education pedagogy, critical digital pedagogy, and assessment. Stommel was most previously a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has a rascal pup, Emily, a clever cat, Loki, and a badass daughter, Hazel. Jesse, we are so honored to have you here today.
I'm so glad to be with you all. There was something that was said in Rachel's introduction to today that really resonated with me. This idea that we are meant to be here to consider the stuff I'm going to talk about today and what schools might be. It reminds me of a line from a critical pedagogue who talks about imagining the world as though it might be otherwise. And I think that that's in some ways what we're called to do in this work in education right now, is to imagine the world as though it might be otherwise. And so I totally love the invocation at the beginning of this, that what we're meant to do today is to sort of sit with some ideas and figure out how they fit with, or in some ways do not fit with, our practice. I often say that I don't proselytize for pedagogy. That I don't want my classroom to look the same as your classroom, the same as Matt's classroom, the same as Rachel's classroom. I want all of our classrooms to look different from one another. And I want students to have different experiences with each of us in the work that we do. And so ultimately, it's really about finding what works for you in your space, in your context, with your students. And also with the body that you bring to the teaching that you do. So I'm going to present for about probably 40 minutes. And then my hope is that we can then have a conversation. And that conversation can be both coming on screen as well as, using the Q&A feature. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Before I do that, I am going to give you a link to the slides that I am going to be sharing today. I think that just went through the chat, in the chat. So there's a link there in the chat, and they can probably take these slides and put them on, on the website for this event or wherever else they can share this out with you all. Ultimately, I don't want us to feel like we're following along or that we have to keep up. To some degree, I make these slides for the people who can't be here. And what really matters is the conversation that we have with each other today. Are you all seeing my slides?
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Great. So, ungrading. This is a definition that I came up with for ungrading. That ungrading means raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice. Distinct from simply not grading, the word is a present participle, an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but one of the things that I think is really important for us to think about when we think about ungrading is to think about this as a critical reflection practice, as a way of thinking about our teaching and thinking about our teaching in new ways. Not necessarily a set of 5 best practices or 10 best practices or 8 best practices, but instead a way of giving ourselves the necessary questions that we need to interrogate the work that we do with students, to interrogate the work that we do around grading, but also to think about our teaching beyond just the grades that we give. A recent article from the New York Times, and before I talk about this, I want to give a little bit of a trigger warning because this specific article talks about physical abuse. And I am a victim of physical abuse, and I think it's really important for us to distinguish between theoretical abuses, physical abuses, and emotional abuses. And so I don't make this, I don't bring this metaphor into the conversation lightly. From the New York Times in a piece called "When Report Cards Go Out on Fridays, Child Abuse Increases on Saturday, Study Finds." The study tracked calls made to the Florida Department of Children and Families Child Abuse Hotline alongside dates when report cards were released by public schools throughout the state. There was an increase in abuse following the release of a report card when it was released on a Friday, as opposed to other days of the week, leading one of the researchers to offer the practical solution that report cards be released earlier in the week. The idea being that when report cards were released on Friday, it gave a whole weekend where students and their parents were in friction with one another around the grades that were given at the end of that week. And so the argument was that grades should be given earlier in the week. And I found it really striking when I read this study and when I read the New York Times article about it, that there was this offering of the shifting of the date that we give out report cards, but there was no real interrogation of grading systems themselves. There was no giving of a sidelong glance to the grading systems that led to this physical abuse. And when I think about the abuse that grades might lead to, this physical abuse that is documented in this study, as well as some of the emotional abuses that that circulate around grades, I think this is really important for us to think about in this particular moment. A moment when so many of our students are experiencing acute trauma, a moment when so many of our students are having their chronic traumas that they were experiencing even prior to the pandemic exacerbated in this particular moment. For us to think about how grades as a system are not just a bureaucratic system, but they also impact students pedagogically as well as emotionally, and in this case, physically as well. Something interesting, every single time that I have a conversation with faculty, with students about grades, almost immediately the conversation moves to language and words that are increasingly emotional. There is clearly a history of traumatic associations with grades throughout a lot of our students' educational careers. It's something that I'll come back to this throughout this presentation, but what I want to do right now is sort of raise the stakes for this conversation. That this conversation is not necessarily just about report cards. It's not just about whether we will continue to give out report cards or change the way that we approach the use of report cards. It's about rethinking our pedagogies from the bottom up, thinking about who our pedagogies are for and why we approach teaching in the way that we do. Some foundational questions about assessment. These are questions that I use when I run longer workshops about grades and about ungrading. And these are places that I want to begin this conversation, again, because I think there's a larger conversation under which this sits, under which the idea of ungrading sits. Who is assessment for? What's the difference between grading and feedback? Why do we grade? What would happen if we didn't grade? And I think there's a lot of implications in these questions that are important for us to sort of pause on. Who is assessment for? Assessment is for a lot of people. Oftentimes, assessment is for a school board. It's for the future employers of our students. It's for graduate school admission boards. It's for college admission boards. It's for parents to some extent. And it's for ourselves as a reflective process on how our students are doing. And also it's for the students themselves. So when I say who is assessment for, there's no simple answer to this. But one of the things that I think is important for us to recognize is that who is the most important audience for the assessment that we're doing? And I would argue that if our project is to enhance student learning, to support student learning, then the primary audience of assessment needs to be for students. It doesn't mean we cast off all of those other audiences or toss those other audiences aside, but that we start from the premise that grades and assessment are for students. They're a way of us as teachers communicating with and to our students. And then this last question, what would happen if we didn't grade? This is a complex question because the labor conditions for teachers is complicated. Teachers are increasingly precarious. They're increasingly doing precarious labor. And I think it's important to start from a place of recognizing the labor of teachers and the work of teachers, and that ultimately any assessment structure that we create, any pedagogical approach to assessment that we discuss needs to take into account the labor conditions of teachers and the experience of those teachers. And so ultimately, I think that's kind of the tension that we're dealing with when we're talking about grades. This is from Sean Michael Morris, who writes in a piece called "When We Talk About Grades, We Are Talking About People." He writes, deciding to ungrade has to come from somewhere, has to do more than ring a bell. It has to have pedagogical purpose and to be part of a larger picture of how and why we teach. In some ways, I think grades are an elephant in the room of every conversation that we have about education. And that's one of the reasons so much of my practice and my research has circled around the topic and the subject of grades. Because I was in so many conversations with teachers where I would hear us talking about approaches to our practice, and then the question would come up, well, but how would I deal with that in my grading schema? Or how would I grade that? If I was going to do that with my students, how would that be graded? How would that be reflected in our grading system? And ultimately, what I realized over many years was that there was a way in which our grading practices were driving so much of what was happening in our schools, happening with our students. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire argues against the banking model of education, an act of depositing in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. In place of the banking model, Freire advocates for problem-posing education, in which a classroom or learning environment becomes a space for asking questions, a space of cognition, not information. Freire was really pushing back on this idea that we could take as teachers, we could take all the content that was in our brain and put it in the brain of our students, as though I could merely transmit what was happening inside of my brain into the brain of Matt, who is watching this. And instead of that, what he argued for is helping students become readers of their world. And this is really the foundation of critical pedagogy and the movement of critical pedagogy. How do we help students be readers of their world? And for Freire, that meant be readers of their political context, be readers of their geographical environment, be readers of their society, their social movements. But I think there's also a way in which what we're trying to do is help students be readers of their educational institutions, so that students are not just subject to our policies, our curriculum, but students are actually active agents in building our structures and our curriculum. And so that when we think about assessment, what we want is we don't necessarily want students to be free of grades. And this is really what I argue for with the concept of ungrading. We don't just want students to be free of grades. We want students to be critical thinkers of the assessment practices and the grading structures at our institution, so that even if nothing else changes at our institution, or nothing else changes in our course, or nothing else changes in our discipline, the students themselves become more active agents in thinking through, thinking with, and being critical evaluators of those systems and structures they're working within. As a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence. This is from Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. And I think this really gets at something that I think is key when we're talking about assessment. That's assessment, and this is from a thinker, Peter Elbow, who writes about, in a piece called Ranking, Evaluating, and Liking. He pushes back on grades and assessment as a mechanism for ranking students against one another. And he argues that evaluating students is the better mechanism, and that students ultimately should be partners in doing that evaluation. He argues that ranking is problematic and that ultimately we're trying to create communities of learners, people learning together, and that the ranking system and putting students in competition one another frustrates that community. I think Bell Hooks describes the importance of that community really well in this quote. This is the thesis of all of the presentations that I've given over the last 4 years. I put it here because this, in some ways, is the foundation of the work that I think that we're doing. And this drives so much of my thinking on this subject. Start by trusting students. How do we start from a place of believing that our students are adequate and even excellent partners in thinking through their own education, that they're adequate and even excellent partners in doing the work of assessment? How do we draw them into that work? How do we draw them in talking about that work? A Google search for "is cheating on the rise" finds a half dozen articles like this one from the Washington Post, which cites data about the rise of online cheating reported by ProctorU, whose revenue model hinges upon a culture of suspicion in education. Another problem with shifting education online: cheating. One of the things that often gets pushed back when we talk about alternative approaches to assessment is, what if my students are cheating? And what if cheating has become rampant at our institutions? I think it's important for us to think about where that narrative comes from, where that culture of suspicion of students is born from. In 1963, Bowers surveyed roughly 100 institutions and found that 75% of the surveyed students admitted to cheating at least once in their college careers. The numbers have not changed much since then. McCabe et al.'s 2012 Cheating in College includes findings from 150,000 students recently surveyed, showing that between 60 to 70% of respondents admitted cheating. So the truth is that cheating is not actually on the rise, according to this data. Cheating is either flat or on a very slight decline over the last 50 years. So where does this notion, where does this idea that students are cheating come from? And why have we created this culture of suspicion in education, where marks are a mark not only of a student's success or aptitude or excellence or achievement or mastery, but marks also become an assessment of the student's moral character? Wiley surveyed 789 instructors for their 2020 report on academic integrity in the age of online learning. 93% felt students are more likely to cheat online than in person. What follows in the report is a guide to discouraging academic misconduct without any evidence for an actual rise in cheating beyond the imagination of those surveyed. And I want to pause here because this takes me back to the importance of thinking about this both as a way of advocating for students, but also as a way of advocating for teachers. I don't want to demean the 93% of teachers here who felt students were more likely to cheat online than in person. Those feelings were real. They came from somewhere. Ultimately, teachers put so much of our work, so much of ourself, so much of our labor into the work of teaching. And so when students cheat, it has an impact on us. It feels like an affront to that work, to that commitment, to that labor. And so what I would argue here, though, is if cheating is in fact not on the rise, nevertheless, we feel like it's on the rise, that comes from somewhere. And I guess I would argue that it comes from a very, very wealthy industry that is trying to create this perception that cheating is on the rise because they're profiting off of that culture of suspicion that is being created in education. The remote proctoring industry is expected to grow from being a $4 billion market in 2019 to a nearly $21 billion market in 2023. That data is from Vox. My guess is that the data would show that the industry is rising even greater than it was when Vox reported that data. This is from HonorLock. This is a page from their marketing website. They say that their mission is to safeguard academic testing. Your audience is watching. Prospective students, accrediting bodies, and candidate employers want to know if your university's degrees are academically sound. Our patented technology maintains program integrity while providing extensive learner flexibility. Increasingly, this company in this particular market is advertising themselves to university clients. However, many of these companies are increasingly marketing their product to K-12 institutions and institutions at all levels, community colleges as well. So HonorLock says our patented online test proctoring software maintains program integrity while providing extensive learner flexibility. This is HonorLock's patent. HonorLock's patented approach to ensuring integrity lacks integrity itself, going further than assuming students cheat by actually baiting them into doing it. They have patented the use of honeypot websites, which offer answers to exams, tracking students accessing these pages and giving them incorrect answers. So they put out sites on the web so that when a student Googles the answer to a test question, they discover these sites. They then report the student's IP address to their institution, and then they add insult to injury by giving the students the wrong answer. Cheating and plagiarism are pedagogical problems, not technological ones. They're not inevitable. We can address issues of academic integrity by designing proactively and together with students, creating a culture of trust rather than suspicion. Ultimately, I would argue that the mechanism that makes these systems go, that makes a profit market for learning management systems that are tracking students, for student retention software that's tracking students in higher ed, as well as proctoring technology that's tracking students in both higher ed and K-12, is our culture and our system of grading and quantifying learning and ranking students against one another. I'm unsettled by the word ungrading because it feels like a zeitgeist, a fleeting moment in which the thinking about grades is shifting away from crude quantification and toward an equally simplified notion that grades can just as easily disappear into the ether from which they came. However, grades have a history, and I'd argue they're a technology. There's nothing ideologically neutral about grades, and there's nothing ideologically neutral about the idea that we can neat and tidily do away with grades. Coming back to the call at the beginning of this, for us to think with, think alongside, think critically about how grades work within our institutions and within our systems. None of us in our context, or very extremely few of us, can snap our fingers and suddenly make grades disappear. So what we can do instead is, as a group of educators, as a group of institutions, we can think critically about the systems and structures that we work within, that our students work within, and we can also draw students into those conversations. So ultimately, Ungrading isn't about not grading. It's about rethinking the conversations that we have about grading and rethinking the practices that drive those conversations. Historically, grades are more of an anomaly than anything else. They are a very recent technology. Prior to the late 1700s, performance and feedback systems in education were incredibly idiosyncratic. The first official record of a grading system was from Yale in 1785. Throughout the 19th century, they became increasingly comparative, numerical, and standardized. The A to F system appears to have emerged in 1898, with the E not disappearing until the 1930s. And the 100-point or percentage scale became common in the early 1900s. Letter grades were not widely used until the 1940s. Even by 1971, only 67% of primary and secondary schools in the US were using letter grades. So I think it's important for us to think about one of the questions that I often get to the question, why do we grade, is because that's just the way it's been done. That's the way it's always been done. That's the way we do it. That's the way we do it here. That's the way we'll likely continue to do it. And so I think thinking about grades as a technology, thinking about grades as something that we invented in order to solve a particular problem, and then realizing that we have a different set of problems now that we're attempting to solve, and that traditional approaches to grades and marks may not be the right invention to address the issues of our present moment. An objective system for grading was created so systematized schooling could scale, and we've designed technological tools in the 20th and 21st centuries that have allowed us to scale further towards standardization and away from subjectivity, human relationships, and care. When grades were invented, they were invented for many reasons, but one of the reasons that they were invented is so that students, as we moved from a one-room schoolhouse approach, where all students at all levels were working together in a single room, towards much larger schools where students were separated into classrooms, grades were used in order to determine which classroom a student would sit. And even further than that, grades were used to determine where in that classroom students would sit. Students with higher grades would sit to the front of the room. Students with lower grades would sit to the back of the room. It's interesting to think about the way that that reinforces bias and reinforces privilege. And in fact, disadvantages the students with lower grades in any individual classroom. In effect, creating a structure where their grades would continue to get lower and their self-worth and their worth to society would continue to be marked by these grades and reinforced by the structure that those grades were contained within. If I think about our learning management systems, and I think about the way that those are structures, I see a lot of similarities to the way that students are put in a stack where each student is equivalent to one another, where all of the students are rows of equal size and equal weight, and all of their work is a simple column. And we try and create a structure and a system that stacks students and compares them neat and tidily to one another. I also think about the way that the algorithms within a Zoom conversation work, or within a video chat tool, where the students who are more likely to speak, or the students who speak, are put to the top of the queue, are put to the top of the screen, the top left of the screen, if you're using a tool like Zoom. And the students less likely to speak are often put off onto a second page, or a third page, or a fourth page, where they become invisible altogether to both their colleagues within the space, as well as to the teacher working in the space. There's Matt has invited folks to add questions. I will definitely pop open the Q&A immediately once I'm done with this portion of the presentation. But also, if anyone has any thoughts or questions, I'm kind of out of the corner of my eye watching the chat to see if anything comes there. Feel free to throw stuff into the chat. It's sort of, the chat ends up being the hum in the room that we would all experience if we were working together. The grade takes the complexity of human interaction within a learning environment and makes it machine readable. A/A minus, A minus / B plus, H1, H2A, 97%, 59%, 18 of 20, 10 of 20, high first, low 2-1. I go through the exercise of reading through all of those just so I can remind myself of the absurdity of some of these categories that we use in order to put students and student learning into neat and tidy buckets. They don't reflect the actual experience that I have when I work with a group of students or when I work with a group of teachers. They don't reflect the complexity of learning, where different students learn at different times in different ways. Grading tends to undermine the climate for teaching and learning. Once we start grading their work, students are tempted to study or work for the grade rather than for the learning. So students end up working for the grade, writing for the grade, but we also, if we think about how we approach something like giving feedback on a student paper when that paper is graded, our feedback so often becomes a defense of the grade rather than an authentic interaction with the students. And if we think about our own pedagogies and our pedagogical approaches or our lesson plans or our disciplinary curriculum, so much of that is driven by the assessment structures that we work under. So students' work is affected by the assessment that we're doing of it, by that final moment of assessment. All of their work pointing towards that, but also our structuring of a curriculum, our lesson plans are also structured by pointing at that particular moment. We need to design our pedagogical approaches for the students we have, not the students we wish we had. This requires approaches that are responsive, inclusive, adaptive, challenging, and compassionate. This is not a theoretical exercise, it is a practical one. One of the most important things when I think about ungrading is the way that our traditional systems of assessment, our traditional systems for marking and grading, disenfranchise and disadvantage the most marginalized students working within our institutions. How do we build assessment structures? How do we build approaches to grading and marking for the students who are the most marginalized, the students most likely to be struggling? And I think that that's incredibly important right now. When we think about the moment that we're in, who was most disadvantaged by the last 18 months? Who is struggling the most to find their way back to or through traditional institutions of education? And how can we think about building structures for the students most likely to be struggling? Black girls, this is from a piece called Soraya Shimali. All teachers should be all teachers should be trained to overcome their hidden biases. She writes, Black girls are 12 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended. This is a piece in Time magazine. You can find it relatively easily, and she actually links to the studies from which all of this is drawn. While Black children make up less than 20% of preschoolers, they make up more than half of out-of-school suspensions. Teachers spend up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students. They also are more likely to interrupt girls. When teachers ask questions, they direct their gaze towards boys more often, especially when questions are open-ended. If you think about how those moments in these students' educational careers impact all of the learning that they do throughout their educational careers, every student who comes to our classroom is both the material circumstances they show up with, as well as their entire educational histories. And those educational histories have a direct impact on how they perform within standardized assessment structures. Food insecurity is a significant factor in determining the average math SAT score. An increase in food insecurity lowers the student's math SAT score. Osterk et al. Found that students perform more poorly on exams when they are several weeks removed from receiving food stamps benefits. So it's not just their material circumstances, the likelihood that they might be food insecure, but how recently they have received support, and how are our institutions playing in a role in providing that support. Children displayed a statistically significant increase in cortisol level in anticipation of high stakes testing. Large decreases and large increases in cortisol were associated with underperformance on the high stakes test. Large increases in cortisol would be associated with acute stress, with acute anxiety, with incredibly high stakes. decreases in cortisol would be associated with disassociation and long-term or chronic trauma. So if we think about the present moment we're in and the likelihood that our students are experiencing stress, anxiety, or that they're experiencing chronic trauma or disassociation, and you think about how that impacts their grades and the work that they do in our classes, it gives us a different picture of when we're marking students, when we're grading students, what are we actually grading? Are we grading their aptitude? Are we grading their mastery? Or are we grading their material circumstances? Are we grading the likelihood that they are disadvantaged or marginalized? So I want to talk about some alternative forms of assessment, and I hope that during the Q&A we can start to suss some of this out a little bit and talk about some of your individual challenges, the practices that might work for you in your particular environment. A few of the approaches that and actually absolutely, Ruth, cortisol long-term health concerns, there's a number of studies, and I actually took them out of this presentation, but I have shared them in some other presentations. There's a number of studies that talk about something like a feeling of belonging or a feeling of connection and how that becomes correlated with the length of someone's life and their lifespan. So the disconnection that we feel or the alienation that we feel actually not only decreases our performance on exams or our performance in institutionalized schooling, but it also shortens our lifespan. So thinking about not our work as teachers as not just about helping students succeed, not just helping them get better grades, not just helping them with their learning, but also having a real impact on their lives and their futures. Because if you think back to that data about the student, the Black female student who was expelled from preschool and how that changed her entire educational career and likely her life beyond that, we play a role in that, affecting students' educational careers, which ends up affecting their lives well beyond just the experience they have in our class. So a few alternative forms of assessment, some ways that we can counter some of the failures of objectivity in some of our systems, the failures of standardization to actually meet the needs of the specific students that we're working with. Peter Elbow has an idea called minimal grading. And for Elbow, and this is from a piece that he describes talking about creating a system for grading that's simpler, fairer, and clearer. If you Google Peter Elbow, simpler, fairer, those are three very hard words to say together. If you Google Peter Elbow, simpler, fairer, and clearer, this will come up relatively quickly. But he argues for using fewer gradations to make grading more meaningful for students. He talks about how grades are meant to be a way for teachers to communicate with students, not just to students, but to have a two-way communication. And that's why ultimately I would argue for having students involved in the grading or assessment process. But what he argues is he argues that a system of 1,000 points or a system of 100 points or a system, thanks for sharing that link in the chat, Sarah, or a system of where students are getting a 96.7, he argues that ultimately it fails not only pedagogically, because it has students working for extrinsic motivators, which end up not being nearly as effective as having students work for intrinsic motivators, but it also fails to communicate clearly with students. If one student gets a 96.7 and another student gets a 95.3, what is the functional difference between those two marks? What do those two students know about their performance? And ultimately, what he argues and what I would argue is that the only thing we know is that the 96.7 is better than the 95.3. So what it does is when there are large gradations, they end up succeeding at ranking students against one another, but they fail to actually have any nuance in how they communicate with students. And so in place of those systems with lots of gradation, he argues for systems with fewer gradations. So he argues for something like a 3-point scale where you have a check minus, check, and check plus, or a 2-point scale where you have something like needs revision and accepted, or a 1-point scale where it's either turned in or it's not turned in. And then he also argues for something which I think is probably the most brilliant thing that he talks about in that piece. He argues for 0-point assignments, which are assignments that are not turned in, asking students to do work, but not evaluating or even collecting that work. And ultimately, what I think that does is help students realize that the work is for them, that the work isn't necessarily for us, that we aren't the only audience for their work, that their peers are also an audience, but also that some of the work is formative, that some of the work is for them to work through their learning. And someone will ask, well, if it's a 0-point and you don't collect it and you don't put a check mark next to it, how do you know whether students actually did it? And the answer to that for me and for Peter Elbow is that you don't know if they actually did it. And that's all right, because ultimately, if the work is for them, it doesn't need for us to police the doing of it. Contract grading. Grading contracts convey expectations about what's required for each grades. Students work toward the grade they want to achieve, and goalposts don't unexpectedly shift. So helping students be able to work towards a specific grade and then telling them exactly what they need to do in order to get that grade. A friend and colleague of mine, Asao B. Inui, he writes about labor-based contract grading, which ultimately is, if you do this amount of labor, you will get this grade. So it's much less about the product and the quality of the product that students produce, and much more focused on the process. And you could argue, well, don't we want our students producing quality papers, lab reports, or whatever else it might be? And I guess I would argue that practicing, having students practice towards that thing and having them practice without high stakes and without extrinsic motivators is the way that we get them towards quality products. Process letters, asking students to reflect on their work and offering feedback on those reflections. Students help guide the grading of their own work. This is what I have done for the vast majority of my career, is some version of process letters. I've had students write self-evaluations, do self-grading, write letters to me, write letters to themselves. Also, portfolios just came up in the chat, having process letters be a part of the portfolio. And then ultimately, if I approach the portfolio as the teacher to offer feedback to the students, I don't offer feedback on the entire portfolio. If they've collected 10 artifacts, I focus my feedback as a response to their process letter. And what I often have students doing, because I have students doing a lot of 0-point or 0-scale assignments that I don't even look at, that I don't even see, nor could I, because they're not turning them into me, is I have, during those process letters, I have students link to, point to, or gather several representative works, which is somewhat similar to the idea of a portfolio, although it's not comprehensive. Students get to gather together the things, not necessarily that best represent their work, although maybe that's a piece of it. Also, the things that they feel like they could most benefit from me reflecting on or commenting on. So in a way, my students do a lot of work, but I don't feel the need to offer feedback on every bit of that work. I have the students driving not only the assessment or the grading, but also driving the feedback that I offer them, so that it's a real conversation. I'm not assuming what they might need or what kinds of feedback they might need. And the last one here, authentic assessment, having students do work for real world audiences, focusing on intrinsic motivation and drawing students into the design of assignment and assessments. How can we have students doing work that feels intrinsically valuable to them, where they're creating things either for their peers or for real world audiences, and they care about the construction of that thing? And I think one of the ways that we do that is by having students be co-writers of the assignments and the assessments that we create. And this doesn't necessarily mean we come in on the first day with nothing and students create everything, but it might be as simple as creating a rubric with a 5x5 grid and leaving 5 of the boxes empty and asking students to think about and fill those boxes. Ultimately, I'm not a fan of rubrics. I'm not a fan of rubrics because they try and oversimplify something that I think is deeply complex. I am a fan of students thinking through and thinking with rubrics as a way of thinking about what good writing looks like, what a good lab report looks like, what good work in any of our disciplines might look like. I'm going to skip a few slides here, but these are all, again, I'm going to go ahead and throw the link to the slides in the chat again. And you'll see why I'm skipping these. I've included in the slide a bunch of the frequently asked questions that I get, and then some answers to those frequently asked questions. And so ideally, that's for people who couldn't make it to the presentation today. My hope is that we can talk about some of these things together. So the questions that I have in here: would you describe ungrading as a decolonizing pedagogical practice? Let's talk about that. Also, thinking about big classes and how do we adapt some of what I've talked about for big classes. Thinking about the precarity of teachers. How does this work change depending on our precarity in a classroom? And then the last one is I share some specific examples of process letters that I have students write and the kind of prompts that I use for that. Again, happy to talk about any of this, but you also have it as a resource that you can take with you. My view of students as complex and deeply committed to their education is fueled by the thousands of self-reflection letters. Any assumption I might make about students is squashed by what they write about themselves and about their own work. And this is a bit from Marty Bickman, who in a piece called Returning to Community and Practice, he writes, "We often ignore the best resource for informed change, one that is right in front of our noses every day, our students, for whom the most is at stake." And I want to end my presentation and open this up to question and answers with a few of what I call good for some people in some contexts practices. I'm really not a fan of best practices. If any of you have heard me speak before, you've probably heard me rail against best practices. To me, the notion of best practices presumes that my classroom looks the same as yours, that there's a set of things that I might do that you could do exactly the way that I do them in your classroom. And also that there's a set of 5 things that just work for each student, for each teacher, for each geographical context, or for each moment in time. Ultimately, I think students learn in different ways at different times for different reasons with different people. And that's ultimately a good thing. We don't necessarily want our practices to congeal into what is often called best practices. So instead, I think of these as ways to begin, questions to ask yourself as you're thinking about ungrading or thinking about changing your approach to assessment. And the first one here is that these things can be simple. You don't necessarily have to change everything that you do. Ultimately, I argued at the beginning that changing the way that we grade is ultimately about thinking about all of our pedagogies, but it doesn't mean we have to change all of our pedagogies all at once. That would be overwhelming, and we would all say, God, yeah, no thanks. Instead, it's about taking small moves and thinking critically about your pedagogy from one year to the next, from one course to the next. So the first one I have here is to change how you talk about assessment. Ungrading works best as part of a holistic pedagogical practice. Use words like ask or invite rather than submit or required. Ask students about their expectations for their work rather than centering yours. So look at the language you use to talk about your teaching and think about how that language is centering students and their experience and their learning rather than your evaluation, your policing, your ranking of those students. How can just the way that we talk about the assessment we do change the way that we do that work with students and the way that they feel about that work? 2, invite students to a conversation about grades. This is the thing that I would say is the best thing to do if you do nothing else. Take 50 minutes or even 25 minutes. Have students read something short like Alfie Cohen's The Case Against Grades, a really, really worthwhile, very short piece about grades and pushing back against grades as a structure. And then ask students to talk about it. Have them talk about their experience with grades. Have them answer questions like, how do you feel when you're graded? Be frank with them about how you feel when you're graded. Thanks for sharing that link in the chat. And just that conversation alone helps bring students under the hood of our assessment practices so that they actually feel like they're partners and agents in it, as opposed to assessment being something that's done to them. It's something that's done with them. 3, grade less stuff, grade less often, grade more simply. Create space in your course for discovery and experimentation. Use a grading scale that feels less arbitrary and communicates more clearly to students. Ask students to do work that you don't collect. Think about the ways that we can change our systems and structures so that students are not being graded constantly, and that we also are not engaging with our students from that space of grading and feeling like we have to do that all the time. And then the last bit, ask students to reflect on their learning. Ask what barriers they face, listen, believe the answers. And I want to end with I've been thinking a lot about best practices. I've been thinking about what we need instead. My first response to that is that we need good for some people in some context practices. But I think it's also important for us to think about necessary practices, the things that make the conditions for learning possible, the things that make the conditions for teaching effectively possible. And how do those impact the work that we do with students? How do they impact our assessment practices? So I have a few of those here that I want to end with. Again, probably as a provocation, a sort of entrance into conversation, because there are a lot of these practices that we could suss out together. One, pay teachers a living wage. This includes academic staff, support staff, librarians, and substitute teachers. I read a report recently, and I don't remember where it was from, but the report was about substitute teachers being paid minimum wage for doing the work that they do. Ultimately, if someone asked me, how as a district can we change our assessment practices? And I found out that substitute teachers were being paid the minimum wage, I would say, well, that's the problem right there. There's actually something at the core of how your institution thinks about the labor of teaching that is a barrier that we have to knock over before we can get to the next step about talking about productive approaches for assessment. Two, know whether or not your students had breakfast. Don't expect representative performance on high stakes exams from students whose basic needs aren't being met. So if students' basic needs aren't being met, our conversations about assessment and grading are meaningless, because the primary variable will be their likelihood that they're food or housing insecure, not their aptitude, their mastery, their success. Three, know whether your students have a place to live. Don't assign homework, especially not graded homework, unless you know that every one of your students does. There's a piece by a colleague of mine called Chris Schaffer. He writes, homework is a social justice issue. Ultimately, thinking about homework and the way that homework impacts students who have no homes or have no safe homes or have complex lives at home, and how that impacts their ability to do that homework. If that homework has a high impact or effect on their grade will be a measure of the likelihood that they have a safe place from which to do homework. And finally, work to minimize harm. Are you educating people, destroying them, or teaching them to destroy other people? I think I'm preaching to the choir. I think the people here feel like our job is to educate people, but make sure that we start from a place of minimizing harm. Start from a place of acknowledging that our students have experienced traumas, chronic and acute traumas that have led them up to this moment of the experience with us in the classroom. So I'm going to stop my slides and thank you and open it up to conversation. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to continue chatting with you all.
All right, thank you, Jesse. And just as a reminder, the Q&A feature is open, so you can add questions, and you can also upvote questions from fellow participants that are resonating with you as well. Why don't we start with a question from Michael Marchioni. He says in the Q&A, in Ontario, we have certain school years where we have to provide provincial standardized tests. How might we balance our pedagogy in addressing the systemic barrier standardized testing enforces?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that our institutions require. There are a lot of disciplines that have specific disciplinary requirements. And I think ultimately we have to work within the systems we have. We can't imagine different systems. We can do as Maxine Green says, and I invocated this at the very beginning of my presentation, imagine a world as though it might be otherwise. And so that is imagining a world that we can change, that we have an impact on. So not just accepting the circumstances that we work within, pushing back on them and pushing back on them hard where it's having a negative impact on our students. Ultimately, I think there's a role of teachers being advocates for students, but we also have to be realistic and recognize that working within our systems is one of the ways that we start to change those systems. So if we're required to give students standardized exams for X, Y, Z reason, ultimately, I think the thing that we can do is help students get inside of those exams, not let those exams be something that is done to them, but something that they are engaged in thinking critically about. So I would have conversations with students about the exam, why it exists, who created it, how long it's existed, have them look at some of the data about the exam itself and who is negatively impacted by the exam, how marginalized people perform on the exam. Having those kind of critical conversations help them get inside of it. The other thing I would say is that oftentimes we think, well, if students are going to have to perform on a standardized exam, we should give them 10 high-stakes standardized exams in order to prepare them for that experience of having to take the required standardized exam at the end. And ultimately, I think that that's not what helps people perform better. What helps people perform better is confidence, not anxiety. And so in some ways, that kind of getting them inside the exam, thinking critically about the exam, looking at questions on the exam, talking about questions that might be on the exam, that gets them to that place of performing better. So another thing we might do is have students taking the exam or practice exams collaboratively, rather than having them take these exams isolated and proctored and in high stakes environments, having them take them in playful environments where they're talking to their fellow students about the exam questions, I think better prepares them for that required exam at the end. But obviously we can't snap our fingers and have that just disappear. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that reminds me actually of Scott. I make connections to Scott Evans' question a little bit further down, where he proposes, like, pretend we could do away with traditional grading overnight in grade schools and high schools. Would we be setting our students up for failure, knowing that they'll be graded that way in college, university, workplace evaluations?
I would say absolutely no, because there are so many people at the college level who will say something to the effect of, well, students have gone through the K through 12 system, and so they expect to be graded. I mean, there's a weird kind of barking back and forth between K-12 educators and higher ed educators that I think is not doing any of us any good. So higher ed educators will say, well, those K-12 people have gotten students obsessed with grades, and so all my students come in demanding that I be graded, and I can't do ungrading. And then you'll have K-12 folks thinking that we're preparing students for a system that exists beyond. I think we have to make change in whatever small pocket that we can work within. And ultimately, I will say that that there's something about systematized schooling, K through 12 and higher ed in the US, in Canada, beyond North America, where people will often say, well, students are graded in the real world. They'll get graded when they get to their job. But there is no space in the world where people are graded and ranked against one another to the degree that they are within schools. And so I think we can always err on the other side of pushing back against this, even if we don't change it entirely, even if this isn't about throwing it out entirely. We need to make movement away from quantified assessment and standardized assessments.
Christy, you have a question?
Yes, no, I have my hand up because I'd like to comment on that. I think that I've just had this light bulb moment where I'm, seeing how students could be more confident, right? Whether they have the grade or not, right? If you're producing a more confident learner, then I think their performance would be better, even if they did encounter a system where they weren't familiar. Maybe that's just right. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things is, if we think about grades, and I don't think that grades are universally traumatic, but I think there are definitely systems and structures where grades are used in a traumatic way. If we think about the impact that trauma has on someone, it creates an aversion, it creates dissociation. And ultimately, it's the same reason to give students 10 high stakes exams in order to have them prepare well on this one at the end. We've traumatized them 10 times and think that will help somehow as they perform the 11th time, when in fact it has the opposite effect. It ends up making them lack the confidence that they need, as you said, to perform.
Yasna, you had a comment?
Hey, all. For about 12 years, I worked at a grade 7 to 12 school in Toronto that had no marks, no report cards, and teachers functioned more as facilitators and cheerleaders than sages on stage. And it was a really, really interesting experience. And for those students who were in the right place, because not everybody came to us for the right reasons, they succeeded brilliantly. They were able to pursue their passions. They were able to move on to higher education, start businesses, and so on. So there is no need for marks for students to succeed in life. I just wanted to share that because I was there for quite a while, and I don't know how many of you have had an experience like that. So I thought it might be an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Catherine.
Hi. I just wanted to jump on board with this. This is my first year that I'm taking a look at ungrading, and we're exploring it, reading some books, coming to some of these things, and trying to take a look at what that looks like in elementary. I teach grade 5, and I think I speak for a lot of elementary teachers this year when I say that we are seeing a different child this year in a lot of our students. We're seeing a very different classroom community. We're seeing a very different mental health level. There's a lot of things that are impacting a child's access to quality education and building their skills as a learner in the classroom this year. So this couldn't have been a better year to introduce this into my practice. And I taught grade 8 previously, and I'm teaching grade 5 this year. And grades were always super important to grade 8s, I think, because they were heading into high school and heading into grade 9. And, you know, there's all these programs available, and grades become a little more weighty as they get older. But coming into this grade 5 classroom and seeing where these children were at, the grades needed to be the least of their concerns this year. And so when I first introduced it and I created these feedback logs for each child that they could go into and read and comment on and discuss and all these different things. At first, there was a little bit of pushback. Well, how do I know what I got? Like, well, how do I know what I did? And so we've had lots of conversations that I've been trying to lead as I learn more and more and more. And I think I'm getting a little bit better at it as I learn alongside them. But I handed back a math assessment that we had done at the end of our first unit a couple of weeks ago. And I think it was my first, oh, wow, this is really working moment. Because when I handed tests back with grades on them in the past, you could hear the hum in the room, the negativity build, the comparison, the, well, what did I do wrong? And all they would look at was the number or the letter that was at the top of the first page, and they'd go no further. Unless I would facilitate taking them up, discussing it, and going through it. It wasn't intrinsic in and of themselves to go through and see what they had done and what warranted that number or that letter. But I handed back this unit test last week, and the conversation was fascinating to me to listen to, and they're only in grade 5. I didn't put any marks. I barely even put check marks on them. I just went through it. I wrote comments. I was like, wow to this, and oh, and could you this, and all these different things on this test. And the way the kids were talking to each other and about the test and going through it and the experience that came out of it afterwards, I was like, this is working. And it just pushed me even further to where this could go throughout this year and hopefully beyond. So thank you. I'm loving it.
Yeah. Thank you. One of the things that I'm thinking about as you're talking is the fact that, you know, I made some nod to this in my presentation, that I've been doing this practice for 21 years, which means I've worked with thousands of students and I've read thousands of student self-reflections. And something about just the sheer weight of how many of those I've read over the many years helps me kind of see inside of student learning in a different way. And most of the folks that I recommend having their students do self-reflections, and I will just say that you can have students do self-reflections or do self-assessments, even if you change nothing else about how you grade. Even if you as the grader are still going to put a grade on it, having students sort of intervene allows you to kind of see inside of their heads and have them be partners in the process of giving the grades. But the other thing it does is it allows us to see who our students are and what they're experiencing. And you find out things that are just wild, like the student who's falling asleep in class who you realize is food insecure and is not getting enough to eat. And it isn't that you ask students to share that stuff necessarily, and certainly you don't require it. But the gist is you just end up getting a much bigger, fuller picture of students when they're partners in this work. I also, as you were talking, I was thinking about the pushback against ungrading, where I sometimes get accused of being a touchy-feely teacher, and then I'm not nearly rigorous enough. the thing that you just described sounds deeply challenging for you and for those students. Like you're doing sort of peak level learning work. I don't love the word rigor, but if there was a proper use of the word rigor, it would be to describe that, not to describe students being funneled through a standardized exam. So thank you so much.
We've got one question coming in the Ontario context at the secondary level. We have marking categories or assessment evaluation categories where we're required to report on knowledge and understanding and communication and application and thinking inquiry as sort of as buckets as we sort of see them in separate categories. And Jessica earlier was wondering about thinking in that like simpler, fair, clear, using the rubrics with all those categories often looks overwhelming. You know, you talk, but you don't like those rubrics that are overwhelming. Do you have any ideas for how do we make them simpler, but still achieve the goal of marking all these assessment categories?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that I would say. One is that Peter Elbow argues instead of for 5, which I would as well, instead of arguing for 5x5 rubrics, he argues, think about, can we make a 3x3 rubric? Can we make something that our brain can sort of get around, that helps simplify rather than in some ways 5x5 or 6x6 or even bigger can overcomplicate our thinking about something. So ultimately, can it be smaller rubrics, or can you push yourself even further so it's a 2x2 rubric? And so that's one thing I would advocate. The other is drawing students into conversations about the rubric and about the structure. So if there's something that you're required to use at your institution, again, ask students, why does this exist? What is this trying to achieve? How does this reflect your learning? How does it fail to reflect your learning? Just getting students thinking about that, I think, can help a great deal. But truthfully, every single time I've seen someone take a 5x5 rubric and reduce it to a 3x3, it ends up being a really useful exercise.
And to follow up, another popular question from Jessica actually is the classic question about parents in grading and assessment. You know, getting that pushback from like the when I was in school conversations that you have with parents. Any insight on that?
Yeah. Well, ultimately, I think that we have to think about who are we, what is the role of teachers? And ultimately, I think teachers are advocates for students. They're advocates for students to parents, to administrators. Ultimately, administrators do the work of keeping the institution going. And I think ultimately the role of teachers is to be advocates for students to the institution, and also to some degree advocates for students to parents. And it's super complicated work. So that is not to make it seem like it's easy. Obviously, I'm not advocating that we get into fights with parents, but ultimately asking ourselves, what is best for the students in this situation? And I think one of the ways to kick off that relationship with parents is to describe that work, to say, you have a really important role here. You understand who these students are outside of school, and I need you as partners in this conversation. My role is ultimately to be sort of a guardian of students' learning and their learning experience. And then what you end up doing is having a partnership, having a conversation with parents, instead of feeling like you're at odds with them. Now, what do you do in the situation where the parent says, when I was in school, XYZ happened, and I want you doing this with my kids? And that thing, you know, because you're an experienced educator and have done research, have gotten particular kinds of training, you know that to be harmful. What do you do in that situation? I think that that's incredibly hard and hard to negotiate. And that gets back to this, there is serious emotional labor in addition to physical, intellectual labor in the work of teaching. And so I don't have an easy answer for that bit. That's something that has to be negotiated with each situation.
One thing that's resonating with a lot of folks here is SJ's kind of comment. And I remember in a previous workshop that I attended of yours, you talked about this. She says, even though I'm a math teacher and lover of numbers, I've always hated marking and grading, since I've often found, even though grades are called standardized, it's very clear that this is so untrue. Between teachers, between class, between schools, boards, let alone between students themselves.
I think there's and this goes back to the last question. If there is an appropriate way to share research with parents, that is a valuable thing to do, but that can also just not work and can short circuit the relationship that you're trying to build with the parent or with the student. But there's so much research that shows that grades aren't actually objective. And so the second that we start to just gather even a small portion of that research, it can be a way of pushing back on this notion that grades are objective or that standardized tests are objective. When you see data as simple as the food insecurity data that I showed and the effects of that on standardized testing, when you see that data, it starts to make you realize, oh, and then you ask the question, well, what are we testing? Are we testing aptitude? Or are we testing the likelihood that our students are food insecure? What do we actually want to be testing for? If we want to be testing for aptitude or mastery, we have to find more creative solutions to do that and draw students into a partnership relationship around that. This question about math discipline, I often get the question, well, how does this work in math, or how does it work in the sciences? There's a book I would recommend by John Holt, if you haven't read it. It's actually the first pedagogy book I ever read. It's John Holt's How Children Fail. And it's a book where he talks about his experience as an elementary math educator. And it's the first pedagogy book I read. And it is also something that has continued to impact and caused me to kind of rethink my own approaches. He didn't continue being a math educator, and this is really a reflection on his experience during the first years of his career. But it's still a useful way to think through some of this stuff that is being asked about, not just in this question, but other questions as well.
Frana.
Yeah, I think I just had sort of like a comment and maybe a question wrapped up in there. So I teach music primarily, and occasionally with a smattering of ESL and student success and 3U English and whatever else, basket weaving 101 or whatever they care to give me that semester, which is fine. And I feel really good about how this whole ungrading thing works in my music classroom, because I always talk about the kids like, they come in with, this kid has Royal Conservatory grade 10 and this kid's never touched a guitar in his life, and they're all in the same class. So I say, we're working at our own pace, we're setting goals, we're doing all of this. And so like my expectations are going to be different, blah, blah, blah. And it works. And we sort of build towards that. And then at the end, it's like, oh, it's midterm time. We need to have a mark. And it's always really, challenging. So my marks are really high in music, which is, I tell them that's where I want them to be, because I'm not here to break people's spirits. But I find it really challenging to flip the script and then be like, okay, folks, let's take my ESL class and prepare them for the literacy test. And I guess I'm just struggling with like the actual practical applications of something that I think is so meaningful and so important, especially when you're working on a course team and people aren't on the same page. So I don't know if there's a question there, or just a reflection, or my own personal struggle, or I just like to talk. I don't know, but this is what it is.
All of the above.
Something like that.
I'm actually thinking about just the importance of, so the thing that I started thinking about as you were talking is, when you were talking about music, I was thinking about how important practice and play are within music as a discipline. And then I was thinking, could we ask the productive question of all of our disciplines? What is the importance of practice and play in discipline X? And do traditional marks, do traditional approaches to assessment help create a fertile environment for practice and play? I can't think of a single discipline where at any level where practice and play aren't crucial to the learning of the thing. Whether it's in K-12, whether it's in elementary, whether it's in post-secondary, whether it's in graduate school. I mean, I even think of something like academic writing. Academic writing, practice and play. That's how you do it. That's how you learn it. And so if we agree with that not that practice and play are the only thing, but that they're a crucial component of, then we have to make space for them within our practice. And so many of our standard, I think that's the thing that you're experiencing when you get to the middle, when that giving that midterm grade, it doesn't jive with any of just the fundamental work that you're doing up until that point. Another thing I was thinking as you were talking is my favorite, and if people have read my work, I referenced this. My favorite comment that I've ever gotten from a student, which is, I did more work for this course than any course I've ever taken in my life. It was an easy A. And ultimately, if we can find ways, and it sticks with me to this day as like, that's the teacher I want to be. That student described the teacher I want to be. Challenging, getting students to go out of their comfort zones and do work they never would have imagined themselves doing, but never worrying about a grade. Easy A wasn't the course was easy. It was, I never felt like a rug was going to get pulled out from under me. I always knew what to expect.
Yeah.
Another question here. Sorry. Another question here from Jim Stratton. We only have a few more minutes of questions here, but this is another about the struggle. He says, this is the third time I've done grade lists with my grade 11 college level English class. But this group is dead silent and it is a real grind. Do you have any suggestions for doing grade lists with a silent group who struggle to engage in basic discussions?
Oh gosh, it's, when you're doing a seminar style class and people are dead, it's one of the most difficult things as a teacher to ask a question and then sit in the silence. And then just, we're a lot of us are trained and a lot of us practice being silent for 20 seconds because that's how you draw students out. But when you're silent and it's like 2 minutes, you're like, oh, ouch. And you feel this, you get hot in the face and you're like, what is even happening here? So I totally feel for this. And I've absolutely experienced it. And sometimes you can't predict the text or the topic or the specific class or the specific day that will make this happen. I guess one of the things I would say is that this goes back to the labor of teaching. We have to find ways to give ourselves grace. This work is hard. It doesn't work every time. Sometimes it's a disaster. Sometimes you do something that you did the previous term and it just doesn't work. And so starting from a place of giving yourself grace and then pivoting, like, I don't think we can pivot. I hate the word pivot because of the whole pivot to online. It's a word that I just want to have go away and never hear again, but it has some practical uses. But this idea of in the moment being able to pivot, being able to adjust our pedagogical approaches when we notice something is going wrong, to be able to let go of the thing that wasn't working and move to something else. I think that really depends on grace. Because if your face is red and you're caught in that moment and you feel and you're sort of beating yourself up, why didn't I ask a better question? What's even going on here? Should I even be a teacher? And honestly, we've all had those moments, I think. The first thing that we need to do in order to be good at pivoting on the fly is be able to give ourselves grace. So that's the thing that I would say. And then once you give yourself grace, pivoting sometimes means letting go of something that you had planned and moving to something else that's going to work. In that particular example, I immediately thought, yikes, I would throw them into small groups. I would throw them into small groups just so I had a moment to collect my thoughts and get myself in an emotional place where I could continue. Just give myself a moment to breathe.
Jim.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll just, oh, sorry, is it there? Thanks. I'll just kind of springboard because it's tricky. It's not even necessarily asking a question and me thinking that it wasn't asked properly. It's like the most basic question. Like I put chocolate bars on a counter and I said, which one do you want? And it was like 3 kids said something.
Yeah.
So like, it's just, they are quiet. And I think the other part of it might be too, that with this schedule, all the work I do in a week, I mean, like when I had done Grease in the past, like a lot of it was that building and getting the comfort level with the system. But now I do that for a week and I don't see them for a week and a half. So it feels like maybe that's also resetting things.
Yeah.
So it might have just been like, maybe this is a crap semester to have done grade lists again, but I just didn't know if you had anything specific for like literally just pure quiet kids who they don't even necessarily reflect as well as I have had kids do it in the past. So it's just like the basic stuff that I need to have happen for grade list to work isn't even really happening.
Well, so this can both work, but it can also backfire. So this is not a simple solution. The thing I'm going to say, something that I find works pretty well is then talking about the room and talking about what's going on in the room. But it's really hard to do that without making the students feel shame, which is going to make the problem feel even worse. So how do we talk about, like, how do we step back from the room and then have people talk about what's actually happening in the room? So kind of follow-up question, what's going on for you when I ask that question, which doesn't necessarily work all that well with the candy bar example, but something just a couple levels separate from that. Like when I ask you that question about the first sentence in this book that we're talking about, what's going on for you? Asking people just to reflect on what's happening for them in their bodies at that moment. But also, I think that as you're talking, I think the community building thing, the second that you said, I don't see him for a week and a half, I was like, shucks. That actually seems like that deeply frustrates the kind of community and trust that you need to build with over time, because like you cease to exist and the community ceases to exist after that length of time. So that might be a structural thing too.
Mm-hmm. We could continue this conversation all night, and I'm afraid we've hit up against our time. So thank you so much for answering questions and for the dialogue. It's been great. As a wrap up in the last few minutes, we do have another exciting opportunity to announce. So Jesse will be joining us for 2 more events that we're calling Fireside Chats in the coming weeks. They are open to a smaller group of Halton District School Board members. Sorry for those who do not work for Halton. And those of you who are really excited by this and looking for it to experiment with ungrading in the school. The Fireside Chats will be during 2 afternoons. We will be providing release time for that, and will be happening virtually. If you have a small team that is interested in this work, fill out the Fireside Chat form that's posted in the chat, and to be selected for this unique opportunity. As well, we always welcome your feedback on what you thought of this evening, the format of these pop-up events. If you're willing to share your feedback on the event, please do so in the same form. And if you do fill in the feedback, you'll be entered into a draw to win some awesome Try, Fail, Learn, Shift hoodies. Yeah.
Wait, do I get a hoodie? I want a hoodie. Am I allowed to sign up for the raffle?
Got to do the feedback, Jesse.
The other thing that I would say is that I put my email and my Twitter in the chat. And so if folks who are in the district want to reach out to me, or if you can't make it to the Fireside Chats, or anyone else who wants to follow up with some thoughts or has more questions to throw at me, feel free to reach out.
Amazing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jesse, for coming this evening. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to share with us and to really sort of help us begin to raise a critical eyebrow. I think we did a great job at that tonight. So thank you so much for coming. And finally, thanks to everybody else who came out and carved a bit of space in your evening and in your brain to really listen, consider, and learn together. So thank you, everybody, and good night.